It seems that human beings were made really for two kinds of things. We were made for creating, we were made for making things happen, and we were made for relating. That seems to be two of the big things that we were made to do. I think there's a third that we're made to do that we're not particularly good at doing, and that's our next guidepost today, and that's about cultivating play and rest. Of course, this series is inspired by a book by Brené Brown, and so we'll read her quote to get us started. If we want to live a wholehearted life, we have to become intentional about cultivating rest and play. And we must work to let go of exhaustion as a status symbol and productivity as self-worth. Exhaustion as a status symbol and productivity as self-worth. How easy is it for us to slip into those modes of being? To think that there's something honorable when someone says, "How are you?" and you say, "Tired." Like you should get a badge for that. Good for you. You're tired. You must be doing stuff. And if you're doing stuff, you must be somebody. She also said this: how can we embrace rest and play if we've tied our self-worth to what we produce? That's one of the big lies that the enemy, of course, has sown since that very first day that he started lying to God's people, that somehow our worth is something that we can generate. And therefore, if it's something we can improve, what's the implication? It's something we can increase it. What's the implication? We might be able to lose it. Well, that's scary, isn't it? If it turns out that our self-worth is in any way tied to our performance, that means our self-worth is a fluid attribute rather than a fixed attribute of every human being. That means that some people are better than others. That means that even though I did well today, if I stuff up tomorrow, I might lose it all. Worth is given, not earned. Psalm 127 puts it like this: it is in vain that you rise up early and go late to rest, eating the bread of anxious toil. Isn't that a great turn of phrase? Eating the bread of anxious toil. I wonder how many of us have that in our diet. The bread of anxious toil. I'm trying to live a carb-free diet. So there's one kind of bread I want to get rid of. I like bread. It's a problem to have a low-carb diet, but let's at least get rid of the bread of anxious toil. How often do we spend our time just thinking about whether we have had enough, done enough, we're going to get enough? It's in vain, the Bible says. Instead, there's this third thing: creating, relating, and then resting, that the Bible has for us. And from the beginning of the Bible, we find rest as a big theme. I love what God says to Moses in Exodus 33. The children of Israel are about to consider going into the promised land. And Moses says, if your presence doesn't go with us, I don't want to go. I don't want to go there alone. And God says, my presence will go with you, and I will give you rest. Isn't that interesting? That with his presence comes rest. And rest, I've found, is less and less a feature of the modern Christian's life. In fact, we are concerned about whether we rest. It's intriguing to me when I talk to people about this, that even particularly Christian workers, if I suggest to them that they need better habits of rest, they'll say something inevitably like, well, maybe I'll get lazy. Maybe I just won't do anything. How quickly the inner critic rises up and says, yes, that's the truth about you. You couldn't rest because you're just a lazy sod. But of course, all the people I'm saying that to are not lazy. In fact, they're quite the opposite of lazy. They're people who do far too much. And if they dialed it back a little, maybe things would work out better for them. This has been a real problem for me in the same way that Debbie's comparison talk is something that's very personal to her. This is very personal talk to me. And partly it's because of the family I grew up in. I want to show a photo, not of my mum, but of actually, would you believe, Debbie is the person on the government website promoting careers under dog grooming. If we could have the next slide, please, Peter. Thank you. So there's a picture of actually Debbie doing dog grooming. It turned out that my mum was one of the very first dog groomers in the city. There was a room at the back of our house that had been converted to a dog grooming salon, and it was called the Poodle Studio. Oh, I was so proud at school. No, the Poodle Studio, that was one business, and Dad was a commercial painter, and if you know my family, you know my brother is now also a commercial painter, now that my dad is retired. And the thing was, growing up in the home of two people who worked for themselves, is that they were terrible at resting. Absolutely terrible. In fact, I go so far as to say, as I look back on my childhood, I can only remember us going on a holiday twice. And sublime and ridiculous. One was to Reparoa. Anybody know where Reparoa is? Just between Rotorua and Taupo. And the other was a big family holiday when I was 13 through Asia. We went to Japan and China and Hong Kong and Singapore. And that was it. Those were the holidays of my childhood. Because my parents lived under this fear. If we don't work, if we take a rest, the work might evaporate. It might disappear. And they lived fearful of that. Now, the irony, of course, was the work never disappeared. It never ended. And that meant that they never stopped working. But I kind of internalized that as a kind of badge of honor and as a way of being. So as a Christian, I found it very easy to slip into over-functioning. I had a full-time job when I first got saved, and yet I traveled 40 weekends a year preaching around the country. I had a full-time job. I just didn't care if I never had a day off. I just loved to be active, and to this very day, I struggle to have to carve out rest time and see that rest is as important a spiritual discipline as anything I might do. Of course, we go back to the Old Testament and we find the Ten Commandments. It's so important to God, it makes the top 10 list. Exodus 34 says, "You have 6 days each week for your ordinary work, but on the 7th you must stop working, even during the seasons of plowing and harvest." I love that. I love that there's even like a condition. And I know you'll be tempted during plowing and harvest season to give the Sabbath a miss. Isn't that interesting? What's our excuse, I wonder? What's the little thing we tell ourselves it's okay not to rest because it's this time of year or this season of my life and I don't need to rest? I wonder. Of course, the Exodus commandment is alluding back to the creation story. This is how pivotal it is. Right there in Genesis we find it. On the 7th day, God ended his work which he had made, and he rested on the 7th day from all his work. He rested. God rested. It's in the nature of God to rest, and as Debbie rightly pointed out, you and I are made in the image of God, and we too are made for rest. And what I'm really intrigued by, if you have a look at this next slide, has the events of the 6 days of creation. You'll notice that on day 6, the Genesis account tells us that beasts, cattle, creeping insects were created, and mankind. So when Adam and Eve woke to their very first day of being human, what day of the week was it? The Sabbath. That was the first thing they had to understand. There's nothing more to do. They woke up after being created on the 6th day. They woke up after their very first night's sleep, and it was the Sabbath. And the Sabbath, Shabbat, actually means stop. That's what the word means. Stop. So I do thoroughly enjoy having Beit Melech on a Friday night as we pray these Erev Shabbat prayers that usher in the Sabbath, that usher in the rest, that cause us all to stop at the same place and the same time and say, that's right. We weren't made just for working. We were made for resting. I wonder how good you are at resting. Hebrews 4 puts it like this: there remains a rest for the people of God. For he who has entered into his rest has himself ceased from his works as God did from his. You are just like God when you rest. Isn't that an intriguing thought? Do you feel like God when you rest? Or are you overwhelmed with a fidgetiness? I get really fidgety when I rest. I have a low kind of boredom threshold. I am quickly fidgety. I need to do something. I do not think of myself as being like God. I feel like I might be wasting time. Anybody else have that idea? Anybody think that rest might be futile, might be pointless, might be wasting? Actually, it's one of the things that you and I are meant to get better at doing. But how many people, when you ask them, what's a Christian like, would they say, well, they're very restful? That comes to mind. How restful they are. I don't think it's an attribute that many would be quick to identify in us. If anything, they might say the opposite. They might say they're very busy people. All these things that they do in church. And you'll note here at Harvest that we try and minimize the amount of things that we ask you to come to. We don't want to load up the week with expectation and activity after activity. Because then we're just playing into the same old game as always, that this was what I was made for. We even have our little phrases, don't we? We like to say, we were saved to what? To serve. Saved to serve. That's all I'm good for. Serving. Why don't we have a phrase in our community vernacular that says we were saved to rest? That would be just as biblical. Isn't it how awkward it feels when I say it? Saved to rest. Like jarring. It's kind of like, what's this guy on? Doesn't he know there are things to be done? Jesus said to the disciples, come with me by yourselves to a quiet place and get some rest. He liked to rest. What to do when we rest, though? There's what I want to pick up on before we finish today. It isn't just about rest, it's about play. And it was David Riddell in Living Wisdom who gave me this way of hearing this word recreation that I found very helpful. He says it's recreation. That during those 6 days of work, I am broken down as all of my energy and my resources are depleted through activity. And on this day of rest, it isn't just that I do nothing, it's that I be recreated for the next day and the next week that follows. So I want to ask you this. It's not just about having a nice lie-in, as nice as that is. Rest is actually a very active thing to do. What is it that recreates you? Now, I had never thought whether or not there was a definition of play. But according to the psychologists, there are. This is what Stuart Brown says are the 7 properties of something that's genuinely play. I thought these were interesting. It is apparently purposeless. I immediately thought of Pokemon. It's voluntary. There is an inherent attraction to it. While doing it, there is freedom from time. I love that attribute. In my childhood, that's got to be my favorite attribute of all of play. Can you remember back to when you were a child and you were playing? Maybe me and my mates used to do shoot-'em-up games. I was lousy because I couldn't do the machine gun. I could only do one shot at a time. I couldn't do still can't do that noise. So I was always get killed by the other kid because he could do a machine gun and I could only do one shot at a time. But anyway, we would play all afternoon. And then we would hear something that would tell us that there had been freedom from time. What did we hear? Come, it's time for dinner. And suddenly you thought, where did that afternoon go? We've only been playing for a couple of minutes, haven't we? Play is a liberty, is a freedom from time. Play diminishes the consciousness of self. I get so caught up in the activity that I kind of forget myself for a second. That's really important, by the way. I've discovered that walking is not play for me because I can think about things. So walking does not qualify as recreation to me. It's too easy for me to think about stuff. I need to do something that engages my brain just enough that I can't think about whatever I might be worried about because I'm actually focused on something else. It has improvisational potential. In other words, it's open, it's not rigid, you can do it different ways on different times, and finally, there is this desire that makes you want to do it more and more. I wonder how good you are at play. I wonder how good I am at play when you think of those activities. Or do you try and squeeze a little bit of work into your play? I just check my emails in the middle of the activity. That'll be fine. Just texting that person. See, that's not play. Now you're trying to wangle something into your play. I wonder if you give yourself permission to play. And I wonder what it's like when you think that maybe the last time you really played, you were little. Do you think of play as childish and work as grown up? I wonder. Because I know that's a problem for me. To think of play as childish, frivolous, pointless. But when I'm working, well, now I'm doing what I should. But you see, play isn't just about imagination. It's about rest and rejuvenation. And cultivating play involves getting actively engaged. And that helps you preserve and refuel in order to do what you want to do to keep that creativity and productivity flowing. So it's really interesting. During World War II, when the supplies of arms and bullets was at its most desperate, they thought for a while there what they should do is run the factories 7 days a week. That'll get enough guns produced, that'll get enough bullets made. And what did they find? Productivity started to decrease when people didn't have a day off. And then someone who maybe owned a Bible thought, what if we give people at least 1 day off a week? And suddenly productivity rose. See, if you think of rest as futile, wasted time, remember that other stuff you think so important, you're bringing a tired and depleted self to that task. And it might be that what's really truly needed is some rest in order to make your productivity more purposeful. After all, ever had a late night and dragged your heels through work the next day? Oh, every hour just feels like a day. Are you productive when you're that tired? No. But what if you live like that and you just forgot? You just forgot what it felt like to have a full cup. That you got so used to living with an empty cup that you just made that your new normal. And I've discovered that many people are so able to adapt that that's what they've done. They've just decided, well, being tired is just the way adults are. But I tell you, 2 years ago, I finished up doing breakfast for 8 years on Rima. 8 years of getting up before everybody else, driving to work in the dark. 8 years of every weekday morning. Do you know what my first thought was? When I'll be able to get back to this bed for some more rest. That was my first thought every day. When will I get to have a nap today? When can I be back here? Always feeling depleted. And then one day I got this crazy idea in my head that I was done. And I told them I'm done with doing breakfast. And so we set a date to stop doing breakfast. Now, I thought it would happen instantly that I'd feel better, but it actually took about 2 months. And then about 2 months after stopping doing breakfast, I remember getting up at a reasonable hour, the time other human beings get up. And for the first time, and I couldn't remember when, I just felt rested, at peace, full of energy, not drawing on the dregs of my reserves, but actually giving out of a place of fullness. I wonder what you'd need to give up to find that place of rest. Because you see, the psychologists have found that the opposite of play is not work. It turns out the opposite of play is depression. The people who don't play are far more likely to battle with things like depression because they're not recreating themselves. In fact, Alice has got to feature in both messages today. We must miss him being in Canada. Alistair actually wrote a book on this very topic called Do Less, Be More. You might like to get a copy when he gets back. It's a good little book. Do less, be more. Because you see, you and I were made to be human beings, not human doings. We were made to be human beings. And yet, so quickly we move on. And Brené Brown points out that actually for some of us, our busyness is a great cover-up. It's a bit of armor that we put on, what she calls crazy busy. That it's great armor, that it's actually a way of numbing our lives. It's actually a way of staying so busy that whatever feelings we'd bump into if we ever took a break, we don't bump into those because we're never alone long enough to ever bump into that stuff. So we're always trying to keep ahead of it. But I'm telling you, it'll catch you one day. And burnout and brown out, you know what brown out is? It's not when the stuff hits the fan. No, the brown out is when a city has a power supply problem and they dim the lights to survive. And brown out precedes burnout. And a lot of people I know, they're in brown out constantly. The lights are dimmed. The things that used to excite them don't excite them no more. The things that used to get them out of bed just doesn't do it for them. So I want to finish today by hearing the words of Jesus. Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Isn't that interesting? He didn't say, come to me, you heavy and burdened, and I will give you work. We were made to create. We were made to relate. If we don't do either of those things, depression will knock pretty fast. But we were also made to rest. Because rest reminds us that we are a human being. And the best place to find my rest, the Bible says it all throughout it. But let's finish with Psalm 62, verse 5. Find rest, O my soul, in God alone. He is the place where I find my rest. He is the place where I can finally come to this moment where my soul can go and be okay.